Today we're going to talk about changes that take place in Europe. So we have some interesting graphics here for you today. During the 18th century, and remember 18th century is 1700. See how that works? Today we're living in the 21st century, believe it or not. So all our dates start with 20. In the 20th century, they all started with 19. So in the 18th century, they start with 17. That's because the first century, well, only goes up to 100, right? By the time you get to 100, it's the second century. Well, that's just the way it works, so don't let that confuse you. So we have both AD and BC. We don't deal with BC in this class. Everything is AD. So I won't even bother to confuse you with the rest of it. Well, one of the things we're going to see happening in Europe at this time is a lot of growth in population, for example. I give you some rough numbers here, estimates, that say over a 90-year period, the population grew by 70 million. And when you start with 120 million, that's pretty significant. Now, why? Why does the population grow? The population can grow because of some, I guess we would say technological changes, but not the kind of high-speed internet technology you guys are accustomed to using. Pretty low-tech, but still important changes technologically are going to make this possible. Just think about it this way, if you go from, say, 120 million people to 190 million people in roughly 90 years, one of the things you're going to have to be able to do is feed all those people, right? That's 70 million people more to feed every day. Or certainly, most people want to eat at least once a day, right? And so that's a lot of extra food. Where's that food going to come from? Well, there is an agricultural revolution, if you will. There's changes to the way they do farming and agriculture that's going to lead to a better food supply, which is going to lead to a greater population. Just to make it kind of simple, but that's pretty much the bottom line. Because you know, when people have not enough to eat or too little to eat, it tends to weaken them, right? I mean, overall, their immunity to diseases. For example, a pregnant woman who has low weight will give birth to a child that has low weight, and then both the mother and the child usually have a lot of health problems, potentially could die. So if you can increase that, you're going to help your population grow. That's just one of the factors. Now, since we have more people around, not only are they going to need more food, they're going to need more clothes. All right? Everybody's going to be wearing clothes in Europe. And unlike Florida, it gets pretty cold there. You know, here pretty cold is like 65. Is what I've come to find out. Let's say it's really chilly out. Ooh. I remember my first semester here, which was a couple of years ago. It was probably in November. I don't know. Hard to tell. They all run together now. Probably in November. And I come to school here, and I get here about, I don't know, let's say 9 in the morning, 8:30, 9 in the morning. And I see all the students that are coming towards the buildings that go to classes. They're wearing like parkas, hats, you know, stocking kind of hats. They got on gloves, some of them with gloves, heavy sweaters. And I'm like, you know, here's what I'm thinking. This is like some sort of a student, like, you know, Freaky Friday thing, like, you know, we're all going to dress weird. And you know what I'm saying, whatever you want to call it, like everybody's decided ahead of time, they sent out some kind of message, hey, everybody dress this way. Because, you know, it was like 65 degrees. And it was supposed to get up to 75 degrees or whatever. And I thought, to me, that's pretty reasonable weather. They thought it was very cold. Now, maybe you do too. They tell me that someday I'll think that. I don't really think so, but I hope so. I'll save a lot on air conditioning bill. Anyway, but people need the clothes. So one of the things that's going to happen is cottage industry. Now remember, cottage industry is not people building cottages. That's what I had somebody write on a test once. Cottage industry means that you are doing industry in your cottage. Primarily, this is with textiles. It's about clothing. You're spinning, you're weaving, you're sewing. This is primarily being done by women at home who can do this work while they're still sort of taking care of their family and doing other things like that. So it's a way for them to make some money while at home. Okay? So they call it cottage industry. And basically they would get paid per skein of yarn, per yard of fabric, per garment that was sewn. So we see really what's developing here in the 18th century is a worldwide market. You can see on this map. It's kind of hard to see, a little bit fuzzy. But basically, maybe somebody turn that one set of lights here out. We didn't do that, did we? No, the other one. Whoa, yeah, there we go. Not all of them. I'll lose everybody. But here you can see we have goods coming from the Americas, North and South America, Caribbean. Things are coming from India, coming around Africa. You just see people are sailing all over the place, carrying goods back and forth. A lot of this is cotton, by the way. The British, who really fuel a lot of this, have used wool. Wool's pretty good for England, but cotton is a lot cooler and can be used more places around the world. So since they already had the technology to make the cloth, they began to make it out of other sources. Anyway, goods are being shipped back and forth. Not only the British, you see there in the green, you got the French. In the purple, you got the Dutch in that sort of tan color. And the Portuguese. And the Spanish. So all over the world, there are sort of colonies, colonization, and the selling and trading of goods. One of the things that's going to happen is that manufactured goods are going to be done in Europe. A lot of this will be textiles, clothing, shirts, pants, that sort of stuff. They'll be made. The raw materials will come in. They will make the finished products. They'll take the finished products out and then trade it, sell it to the people where they get the raw materials. Now another thing that happens, say when the Spanish come to the New World, they do find there is some silver, especially here in the New World, and some gold. But with an influx of new gold and silver into from the New World into Europe, guess what happens? What happens if you introduce more of something into the economy?
Prices go up.
The prices go down. So in other words, let's say the price of gold, I don't know, what is it now, $400, let's say it's $400 a pound. If we suddenly found a lot more pounds of it, the price of gold would go down. Okay? Same with silver. We have kind of a limited amount of silver in Europe, and now we found this new silver in North America, South America. The silver is now, there's more silver, so the silver is worth less because it's not as rare. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is not an econ class, but that's pretty basic econ stuff. The more of something you have, the less it'll cost you, because there's more of it around to go around. So the demand goes down because the supply goes up. Supply and demand. Well, anyway. And what do you think that's going to do to the economy? If, remember, coinage is made out of gold and silver primarily at this point. We find a new amount of gold and silver, the price of gold and silver goes down. What does that mean for the cost of things? Other things. In this you were right. It's going to go up. Other things will go up. Inflation's going to happen because the silver is now worth less. So if in the past I bought a loaf of bread for a quarter, now my quarter's not worth a quarter anymore, so when I come to buy a loaf of bread, maybe it's going to be 50 cents. See how that works? Because that silver is no longer worth as much. Well, basically, we start to develop a world economy with supply and demand. And since money had been tied always to precious metals, if you find more precious metals, it means that inflation is going to happen as well. Well, anyway, one of the main things that people in Europe are wanting, let's say in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, are spices. The food in Europe was pretty bland. Pretty bland. If you think about almost any spice that you use, they did not have it in Europe. The number one spice in the world is black pepper. That's used the most around the world. They didn't have any in Europe. Salt was in limited quantity, but that's not a spice, that's a mineral. They did have some salt. They didn't have pepper. They didn't have cinnamon. They didn't have nutmeg. They didn't have ginger. They didn't have, you think of any of those spices, you go down the spice aisle, of the store, where you can buy them now very cheaply, right? You can go there and buy one of each, of every kind of spice. Maybe there's 50 of them, and you can probably get it for less than $100. You could take home every single kind of spice that's in the store. That'd probably last you for several months, maybe even a year, for less than $100. That's a pretty amazing, because they come from all over the world. People at this time are paying a lot of money for spices. They're hard to get. They're very desirable because people eat food every day, and once they start tasting food with these spices in it, well, they really like that. They want to taste that some more, right? That's why all you people who are addicted to the bean, as I call it, addicted to the bean, the coffee bean, this time of year, you jonesing for some pumpkin latte or whatever they call it, right? Spice, what is this? Pumpkin spice, pumpkin's latte spice, spicy latte pumpkin, well, whatever it is. What do they call it?
Pumpkin spice latte.
Pumpkin spice latte. So you got the spices. What kind are they? It's secret. We can't tell you. But people want that all year long. And then when it comes, it's like, oh, it's September 1st. It's Labor Day. It's suddenly fall. And it's Florida. It's 95 degrees out. But I'm feeling chilly and I'm wearing a parka. All right, and so the other thing that begins to happen is that the Europeans begin to take over some of the land for plantations. Because guess what? A lot of this stuff that they want won't grow in Europe. Cotton does not grow in Europe. It's not going to grow well. It's too cold. These spices do not grow. They will not grow in Europe. Coffee will not grow in Europe. Chocolate beans, the chocolate plant, the cacao, that's not going to grow there. So a lot of this stuff that they want, they figure out, well, if we take over a piece of land somewhere else where it's warmer, we'll get them to grow it, and then we can eat it, consume it, drink it, whatever it is. So that also adds to it. Then with plantation, I'll tell you one of the things they really wanted was sugar. Sugar. There was no sugar, what we think of as sugar, in Europe, say in medieval times, until fairly recent times, because again, it won't grow there. Sugar cane will not grow there. So what did they use? They used honey. Honey was their sweetener, pretty much. That was it. They started getting a hold of the sugar. I mean, it's just like the crack cocaine. People love the sugar, right? I bet you like the sugar too, even though you don't want to admit it. But sugar only grows where it's warm. All right, so they began to cultivate large plantations to grow things like cotton and sugar and tobacco and coffee and, you know, all these things that they really want. Those are very labor-intensive crops, by the way. Sugar, I don't know if you've seen sugar cane. I'm sure some of you probably have. Sugar cane fields take a lot of labor. Because, I mean, it's just thick, right? It's just thick. You let it grow and it's thick. You can't even walk through it. So you have to cut it down. And for centuries, it was cut down by hand with a sickle. You throw it on a wagon, and you're out there where it's very hot and very humid. That's hard work. And then you take it to a place that has a fire, and you cut it up, and you throw it into a big vat with some water, and you let it boil down. Again, very hard work. Until you boil that sugar down into what? What does sugar become? What's that?
Corn syrup? No.
Corn syrup? No, that's from corn.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's all right, but it is syrupy. It's not really caramel. Molasses. Molasses. So you can take, you know, like a big chunk of sugarcane field, right? A big field, and you can boil it down into, I don't know, 20 barrels of molasses or something like that, right? The molasses concentrates the sugar, makes it easier to transport and to store and to ship and all that kind of stuff. Then what did they do with the molasses, a lot of it? Anybody know? What do you make from molasses? Syrup. Well, you can just eat it straight. I like it on beans and stuff. Blackstrap molasses. That's good stuff. But they make it into something else, something even more valuable to some people.
Moonshine.
It's not moonshine, but you're on the right track. It is alcohol. What kind of alcohol do you make out of molasses? Anybody know? Well, this is good that you don't know, actually. That's good. You shouldn't know. Rum! Now, wait a minute. Somebody knew all along. They just didn't want to say it. Yes, you make rum. Rum. So you take a big field of sugar cane, you boil it down into some barrels of molasses, but then you can take that molasses and you can make it into kegs of rum. Rum then is even smaller amount, but you charge more money for it. That can be hauled in ships. Instead of hauling a big shipload of sugar cane, you're hauling some barrels either of molasses or rum. Now, a lot of times the molasses was actually taken from the Caribbean to New England, and in New England they would distill it into rum, but also in the Caribbean they did that too, and then the rum would be shipped around as well. Well, anyway, maybe we're getting too detailed. But this is why you needed so much labor. And that's why slavery became a part of these plantations. Because of very hard work. And to make all of this profitable, you need very cheap labor. Can't get much cheaper labor than slavery. So, actually, most of the slaves from Africa are taken to the Caribbean, to places like Brazil and the Caribbean islands, because that's where the sugar cane was. A lot of them are taken there to work on sugar cane. Well, anyway. So we see society stuck in this pattern. An old order of society is there, but the economy is changing. What is that old order? The old order would say about 2 to 3% of the people are at the very top, the nobility. Then much of everybody else is a peasant. Right? And most of those peasants, at least 90% or more, are working in agriculture. The other 4 or 5% are working in trades, like being a blacksmith, being a tailor, candlestick maker, all that kind of stuff. There are other trades, but most of them are actually working on farms. This is in Europe. And as a part of that, in Europe, there were a lot of people that we don't call them slaves, we call them serfs. S-E-R-F. There were many Europeans who were serfs. Technically different than a slave, but not much. A serf is tied to a piece of land. So let's say I own 1,000 acres of land. There will probably be 100 people who are assigned, maybe more, to work that land. Those people can never leave that land. If I sell the land or give it away or I die and it goes to my son or something, those people and their descendants stay with that land and work it. They are not free to leave. They are serfs. So technically the people are not owned, but they don't have any freedom either. They've got to keep doing the same job. So it's a form of servitude, no doubt. And these peasants, even who are free, have to pay their crops, have to pay at least 1/3 of their crops to the guy that owns the land. Nobles wanted to hang on to their privileges, even though we see the economy changing and we see a rising middle class. People involved in business and in trade are actually making a lot of money, but they don't have the social standing of nobility. And by the way, the nobility did not want to get involved in trade because to them that was work, and they didn't work. I'm noble. I don't work. That's what peasants do. All right. But this is going to create the tension in the society of Europe where you have people that do have some skill and money, but they don't have any political power. And so things will eventually change. Now, another thing that's happening in Europe at this time is with the population growing and with the farming becoming more efficient and with more and more people available, more and more people are now moving to towns and cities. In the past, most people lived in the countryside and in small towns and villages. Cities weren't that large. But now we got a lot more people. So people can specialize in what they're doing and they move to places like London. And we start to see that a lot of towns begin to grow. So that by the time you get to, let's say, 1790, 1800, London is at 1 million people, Paris at 2 million people, and there were 20 cities across Europe that were more than 100,000 people. You've never seen that before in Europe. So with growing towns and cities, that's really going to change the culture. It's going to change the economy. It's going to change everything. So if we want to see why are all these changes taking place, I'm trying to give you some of the factors there. Now, another thing that's going to happen is we start to see global conflict. Since the economy is becoming more global, you've got people in Europe trading things from China, Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, the Caribbean. It also means then that there is competition for these things, for these goods. And so that when conflict comes, the conflict will not be limited to Europe. The conflict is going to go around the globe. Rival countries are going to compete for power and control. And two powerful nations, areas of Europe are in decline. One of them was Poland. Poland had a lot of territory, controlled most of Central Europe. But Poland is getting weaker, and other countries are coming in and taking over, chopping up Poland and taking the land. The other thing is Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is in severe decline, and a lot of its territories are now up for grabs, and a lot of Europeans are going after it, including the Russians, the British, the French, and others. Can I get you to take the earpiece out? Thanks. And so we see rising powers replacing these older powers. Prussia, Russia, and Austria are the growing powers of Europe. So here's one of the things that happens. The partitioning of Poland. The partitioning of Poland. We don't use the word partition too much anymore. Sometimes we use it in a building or something, right? Going to put up a partition. So say in this room, we already have the room. Well, let's say we wanted to divide it into 2 rooms. We might put a partition right down the middle and then put a little door down at one end. So you could just, put a little hallway. You could go into this part or this part. That partition really just means to divide, to cut it into pieces. And this is what happens to Poland. It gets cut into pieces 3 different times in the 18th century until basically there is no Poland left. Started off a pretty big, I'll show you a map, pretty big chunk of land. In 1772 it's divided, 1793 and 1795. There is no Poland left. It is now controlled by Prussia, Russia, and Austria, all the territory that had once been Poland. And of course, remember, the Ottoman Empire is also declining. The Europeans are looking at the Ottoman territory, especially the Ottoman territory in Europe, with greedy eyes. This would be the area of the Balkan states, Eastern Europe. Especially Austria and Russia are moving in to take control. And they do. So this is going to create a lot of tension because you got a lot of territory changing hands, because you got an economy that's global. Eventually, it's going to lead to conflict and war. For example, this is just to show you, it's kind of hard to see here, but all of this, even out here with this dotted line, see out here and way over here, almost this whole map is Poland in the beginning. And you see Prussia to the left, and Russia to the right, and Austria at the bottom there to the south. So here's what happens. This chunk of Poland goes to Russia. This chunk goes to Austria. This chunk goes to Prussia. And it leaves that little central area. Later on, they end up taking over all the rest of it. They just divide it up. It's kind of between themselves. They're looking for the resources. There are some mineral resources. They're looking for the farmland. And since Poland is weak, these countries are growing in strength. They begin to take it over. Well, one of the growing powers then is Prussia. So I'm going to, I think I have a slide or so about each of these: Prussia, Austria, and Russia, just to introduce them, because they do become major powers in Europe in the 18th century. Prussia is growing in power. Their capital is Berlin. So when you think of Berlin, you typically think of Germany, right? You should think of the Prussians as being Germans, but as being very militaristic, very organized, very disciplined in their approach. They're from the northern part of Germany, which, by the way, was the Protestant part of Germany. And they were very organized. All right? Their king is named, you might call him Frederick William, but they would have called him Friedrich Wilhelm the First. He enlarges the army. He creates an efficient government and an efficient bureaucracy. And we see that there is a group of nobility that will be the officers in the military and the leaders of this government. They're called the Junkers. Not the Junkers, but the Junkers. That's how they would say it.
He died young.
He dies young. Well, he reigns. That's his years of his reign. Not his lifespan. Sorry about that. Should make that more clear. But yeah, that's the year that he is actually in power as the king. 7 years. Because you can see the picture of him there, and he looks older than 7. All right, so that's Prussia. Yeah, I got a question.
Yeah, weren't the Junkers though like wealthy people that like own like big estates?
What? No, say that one more
The
time.
Junkers, not the Junkers.
Yeah.
Weren't they like nobility? In the
Sure.
United States?
Definitely.
The whole military. Weren't they-
Yeah, well, here's the thing you got to remember. All across Europe, up until at least World War I, military officers were all from nobility. I mean, in England, in France, in Germany. This is why World War I became so devastating, because actually the percentage of nobility that died was higher, a higher percentage, I mean not numbers, but higher percentage than any other population, because they were the officers. That was just the way the military was structured. Officers were to be from the noble class. They were to be like the sons of dukes and earls and all that kind of stuff. And then they would basically raise a unit from their area. So let's say they're from this region. Let's say if it's around Lakeland, they would raise an army from Lakeland, and the guy who was the Duke of Lakeland would be the general of that unit. And then, you know, the other nobility would be the officers, and they would go off to war and fight as a unit. And so if that unit gets wiped out, like say in World War I, it's going to take out a good number of the peasants or the non-noble, but it's going to wipe out almost all the nobility. So that's what you got to keep in mind. And that was really the sense of their view of the military was regular people aren't really suitable to be officers. That was their view. Their view, nobility had the demeanor, had the education, had the disposition to be officers. And so, a regular guy that worked on the farm is never going to become a captain or something. It'd be very, very unusual for something like that to happen. Okay? Certainly not a lieutenant or something like that. So yes, you're right. The Junkers do have large tracts of land. They are nobility. They are closely tied with the king because they're all nobility. But they also become the officers in the military, leading this. And really what he does, he sort of creates a military state, or he creates a very militarized country known as Prussia. Very disciplined. Well, here's King Friedrich II, 1740 to 1786. He will reign for a long time. He's quite well educated, but what we're going to see here is there comes to be an enamoring with French culture. Because during this period, and we'll maybe talk about it on Thursday, during this period, France has the most powerful king. Has an absolute monarchy. And it's sort of what all the other kings aspire to be. The absolute king of their area. So King Frederick II was well educated. He studied the philosophes. It's interesting that these guys who would probably have most to lose to the philosophes were enamored by what they taught. That you should get rid of despots and tyrants and all that kind of stuff. These guys didn't see themselves as being tyrants, when in fact many other people would see them in that way. But he loved French culture because he wanted to emulate, he wanted to imitate the French because they were the ones who were the most powerful. So in fact, even though he's German, right, he's Prussian, they speak German, his official language for his government was French. So people might be speaking German, but when he entered the room, everybody had to switch to French to address him. All the kind of official documents were all in French because he was imitating the French culture. Now he does enlarge the army. He does gain more territory from Poland. But I want you to notice that he really gets taken in by French culture, especially French culture of the absolute monarchy of France. Now let's switch to Russia for a moment. You can see beginning out this century, there is a ruler by the name of Peter who earns the sort of title, people call him Peter the Great. And you see he rules for over 50 years. Under his rule, Russia really grew and developed. He was a very powerful king or czar. Now he's followed by 6 weak rulers, the last of which is Peter the Third, who in fact was so weak and so inept that he was sort of kicked out of office and murdered by the nobility because they thought he was doing such a terrible job. This then allowed his wife to become the leader of Russia. Her name was Catherine. Now Catherine, who comes to be called as Catherine the Great, was actually of German descent, not Russian descent. Why? Well, remember, if you're nobility, you can't just marry anybody, right? You can't just go down to the local Starbucks and find some lady. Doesn't work that way. You have to find someone of your particular level. So if you're going to be the next king of Russia, the Tsar of Russia or something, you can't just go out and marry any Russian lady that you take a fancy to. That would not be allowed, that would not be proper. So in fact, you would have to marry someone who is of the same social status, which means, since you're not going to marry your sister, you're going to have to marry somebody else's sister from another country, right? So we have the intermarriage of these royal families. This explains why Peter III married Catherine, who's German. When it became time that somebody's looking for a husband or a wife, they would let that be known. They would sort of throw these gatherings or parties where the people would show up and get to meet each other. And that's sort of how it got started. Yeah.
So were they married for that long, or did she live for that long?
She is Peter III, not Peter the Great, his wife. The date's up there for Peter the Great. There are 6 kings down to Peter III.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay.
So she is ruling. He is deposed after just a few years, and then she ends up ruling for about 30 years.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's maybe a little confusing on the PowerPoint. Well, she too studies the philosophers. She too even corresponded with Voltaire. Remember we talked about Voltaire last week anyway. And she purchased Diderot's library. So, she really fancies herself an intellectual, enlightened ruler, but even these enlightened rulers, they're pretty cruel when it comes to dealing with their own people. So I always find that interesting that some of these rulers really take a shine to the philosophes and their teachings, but then they don't really put it into practice with their people. Yes?
Are we talking about Peter here or about his wife?
We're talking about Catherine the Great right now. Yeah, Catherine the Great. Any other questions there? Yeah, go ahead.
Was this the culture where women were allowed to reign?
Well, Catherine, yeah, I mean, again, it is a little unusual, but Catherine was very forceful. And there are a lot of stories about Catherine. I don't know if all of them are true, but I will not relate them all to you here. But she was a forceful woman, and she did rule very strictly. How's that? Very harshly, some might say. So yeah, you're right. There aren't a lot of female rulers in Europe. And sometimes that does create, when a woman, basically the idea is, there are two ways of doing this. One is it goes to the eldest child. The other one, it goes to the eldest male. Typically it goes to the eldest male. However, if there is no eldest male, then it goes to the eldest female to be the next ruler. So here's Catherine again. There's a painting of her. See, very nice. Maybe you should get a sash to wear around campus. A sash and maybe a tiara, like a little crown. Well, anyway, she ruled by decree. I mean, what she would say became the law, and that's the way it was going to be. One of the things that she decided to do is that Russia was kind of unorganized, in her opinion, needed to be better organized, and so she divided Russia into 50 areas, 50 provinces, and then set up 50 provincial governments that would all answer to her. So it probably was needed, really, because Russia was a pretty big country and didn't have the efficiency that she wanted. She also founded schools, especially schools for the training of young girls to be educated, which again was not the normal thing. Boys were educated formally, girls were educated typically at home. They might receive, they learn how, especially noble girls, would learn how to read and write and do those kinds of things. But it was always thought, well, they don't really need to study philosophy and all these other things because they're not going to be doing things where they need that, right? They're primarily going to be having children and taking care of the house and so on. Well, Catherine didn't like that idea, and so she began this. And part of this was probably from the influence of the philosophes as well, plus the fact she's a powerful woman, and she wanted other women to have education. She also instituted religious toleration. Remember, in Russia, they have the Russian Orthodox Church, which was closely tied to the crown, closely tied to the nobility, but she was willing to tolerate non-Russian Orthodoxy, Jews, Protestants, things like that. But still, even though she was a powerful woman, there were limits, because remember, her husband was executed by the nobility. The nobility still had quite a bit of power. And so a lot of the changes that she did, she couldn't maybe go as far as she wanted to go because she had to deal with the nobility, which was always there sort of keeping keeping her from maybe instituting everything she wanted to do. Well, that's Catherine the Great. A lot more that could be said about her. Let's just do a couple more here, and we'll see that she had sometimes very harsh policies, especially for peasants. For all of her sort of forward thinking about education and so forth, serfs and peasants were not to get out of line. Because that's really the backbone of the society, the backbone of the economy. You got to have the peasants and the serfs doing the job to keep everything going. And so when they started an uprising and a rebellion came, one called the Pugachev Rebellion. This Pugachev was a guy who worked in the docks. He was loading and unloading ships. Very hard work. And he kind of organized an uprising because basically he said, you know, we're working hard, but we're not getting much here. And so it was kind of a strike and a rebellion. And Catherine ordered the smashing of this rebellion. Very forceful, very violent. The capture of Pugachev and his execution to sort of make an example of him. Now, the third country you want to mention is Austria. Austria has a slightly different situation than Prussia or Russia because Austria is being the furthest south, has the most contact with diverse groups of people that they are trying to incorporate into their empire. Austria itself speaks German. Austrians traditionally speak German. They're Roman Catholics, and they speak German. But they're going to begin to take over areas that had once belonged to the Ottoman Empire. So they're going to have people who are, say, Eastern Orthodox, people like Bulgarians. They're going to have Muslims. People from, there'd be Slavic people with Slavic languages, Croatians with who are Muslims. So they're going to have at least various Orthodox religion, Islam. They're going to have probably 4 or 5 different languages, and they're going to try to unify all that under the Austrian control. To do that, they want everybody to speak German. That doesn't go that well. They also want everybody to convert to Roman Catholicism. That also does not go that well. This is their way of trying to control things. Leopold I, who reigns, you can see here, for not quite 50 years, is the ruler of Austria. Again, he's going to have to increase the army size. That's what we're seeing all the way around, because they're trying to conquer and control new lands. And he's going to make Austria primarily German-speaking. If you want to get any official business done, you have to do it in German. That's going to be very difficult and be resisted by many people who speak languages very different than German. Slavic languages are very different than German, completely different family groups. So then you got Hungarians, that's completely different. You got Croatian, you got different Slavic languages like Bulgarian and so forth. These are all the territories they're trying to incorporate into their empire. So this gives them some real challenges. Did you get that one? No? There you go. So I'm going to put a map up here, and it's going to show you the areas which they are going to try to take control of. And you'll see where it is. It's primarily in Central and Eastern Europe. So here's the map. You see the area there that's in the green, the brighter sort of green there in the center. That's the Habsburg territory. The Austrian Empire is really controlled by a dynasty known as the Habsburgs. You see the Prussians to the north in that sort of brown color. But notice that the Habsburgs have quite a bit of territory here in Hungary, in Austria, and they're going to be moving into Bosnia, Serbia. They're going to be moving down. They're wanting to get down into this area here. That area had been controlled by the Ottoman Turks. And of course, the Russians are going to be looking to move into that area as well. Because remember, the Russians speak a Slavic language. Russian is a Slavic language. And so in many ways, culturally, linguistically, they are more closely tied to places like Bulgaria than the Austrians are. Now, we were talking about, you were asking about women rulers, right? Here's an example of a woman being a ruler that actually ends up leading the war. So let's try to explain it quickly. It's called the War of Austrian Succession. In the middle of the 18th century, 1740 to 1748, Charles VI, who continues on with the same kind of pattern in Austria, when he knows he's approaching his death, he actually has no male heir. He has a daughter. Her name is Maria Theresa, but he has no son. So this is interesting. He actually went around to the Prussians and the Russians and other people, and he said, hey, now, you know I don't have a male heir, and my daughter's going to be coming to power. I want you to sign this agreement that you won't basically give her a hard time, right? You won't try to depose her. You won't try to take the territory away. And I thought it was very optimistic on his part to actually go to these people and point out his weakness and get them to agree that they won't do anything, which they signed it, but of course they didn't mean it. So after he is gone and his daughter comes to power, then the Prussians will immediately march into territory which the Austrians controlled, called Silesia. Silesia, probably never heard of it before, but the main reason people knew of it is it had mineral wealth. It had different metals in mines. It's not a big piece of territory, but the Prussians wanted it. So they just marched in and took it. Clear violation of what they had promised that they would not do. Well, this then leads to a conflict where basically you see other forces besides the Austrians and the Prussians getting involved in this war of, they call it the War of Austrian Succession because she has succeeded to the throne of Austria, but now they're already starting to take her land. Okay? So the next slide has a picture of some of the mines in Silesia, which is really why the Prussians wanted it. And in fact, what people are going to do is they're going to say, you remember what I told you, how if you were, say, a Russian and you were going to be the next czar or whatever, you would go and maybe marry a German? Or if you're French, you might marry somebody who's British or whatever. What that means is that all these royal families are actually related. So guess what? That means that a lot of them could lay claim to the throne of Austria. They could say, well, Maria Theresa is a woman, you see. This throne should go to a male. I'm the closest male heir to the previous king. See how that works? Even though I'm not Austrian, I mean, you know, I'm Prussian, I'm British, whatever. So a lot of people are starting to lay claim to this and saying, no, I should be the king, no, I should be the king, no, I should be the king. And so we start to see then when several begin to claim the throne. England comes to the side of Maria Theresa and the Austrians. Why? Because they're gentlemen and they just don't think it's fair? What other reasons might they want to defend Austria? What's that? The mines. Well, yeah, they want to get on her good side. Maybe they get some of the minerals. Also, you block other people from getting the mines. You block other people. In other words, the Prussians were starting to get pretty strong, making the British nervous. So we're going to let them get even stronger? Let's side with the Austrians and try to slow down the growth of the Prussians. Well, of course, once the English side with the Austrians, then France is going to have to side with the other side because, you know, the English and the French never get along. England was at war with Spain already, and so then France sides with Spain. And so we see this conflict over who would be the ruler of Austria accelerating from a conflict over a little piece of territory called Silesia to now involving England, France, Prussia, Spain in a conflict. Now, to make a long story shorter, at the end of the conflict of the War of Austrian Succession, Maria Theresa stays in power and she will rule Austria, but guess what? The Prussians keep Silesia. So it's not a complete win, I guess, for either side. Although the Prussians would probably say they pretty much got what they wanted, right? So you start to see how these conflicts get interwoven. Now what we're going to see is that the conflicts in Europe will actually spread across the seas because the Europeans begin to control and hold power outside of Europe. So we see then alliances get to be drawn in the middle of the century, 1748. New alliances of Russia, Austria, France, Prussia, and Britain. We see shifting here. It's interesting. Shifting, jockeying for position. Austria still wants to get Silesia back. Russia agrees to help. And this tension is still there. But this idea of alliances, of one country allying itself with another, maybe shifting and then allying. You know, the British had just been allied with Austria, but after the war and all that's over, they then shift their allegiance to the Prussians. Why? I think maybe they were more worried about the Russians. Once the Russians enter the picture, the British want to make sure they don't get too much power either. So there's a lot of tension, political tension. Growing population, world markets, and internal struggles. You know, this is what happens. Think about it. When things are very stable, right? Anybody here study science, right? You have something that's called equilibrium. Equilibrium in a let's say in a solution or in a system. When things are balanced, they're at equilibrium, everything's very steady. But when you start changing the factors, you're going to have to readjust to get equilibrium again. And that's really what you see here in Europe. Everything's getting shaked up. It's getting shaken up by the changing economy, the changing politics, and people are now jockeying for position with new powers asserting themselves like Russia, Austria, and Prussia, and the older powers like England and France not wanting to lose control. Now we're going to see this all come to a head in really a global war. We don't call it a world war, right? We've got World War I, World War II. We'll talk about them later. But this is a global war. It's called the 7 Years' War. Anybody ever heard of the 7 Years' War? What's another name for the 7 Years' War? French and Indian War, yes. Here in the United States, here in North America, we tend to call it the French and Indian War. So by what we label it, you see what side we're on, right? We're on the British side. We're not always on the British side, but we are for the 7 Years' War. We're on the British side, and the British are fighting against the French and against most of the Native American tribes. There are some that are sided with the British, and the colonists, the American colonists, side with the British. But in the long run, the 7 Years' War is going to be fought on 3 fronts. And again, look at it. It actually lasts 7 years. That's nice, because it's called the 7 Years' War. You can't always, the 100 Years' War does not last 100 years. Just in case you're on Jeopardy someday, and Alex Trebek asks you that question, it does. It lasts, I think, something like 112 years or something. It's more than 100 years. There was a guy that had been one of my students who ended up, he was on Jeopardy. I just happened, sometimes I watch Jeopardy for fun. That's because that's what I consider fun. So I turned it on one evening, several years ago, and I was just sitting there kind of watching it, and I didn't really recognize the guy at first because it'd been several years. He had like changed his hair and everything. And I finally figured out, hey, I know that guy. And one of the categories in the thing was ancient history. And he had been on a trip with me to, I take students on trips. This particular trip he went to me with, we went to Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt, all in one big trip. And so they're asking him questions. I'm saying, you know this stuff. I know you know this stuff. He was getting them wrong. He wasn't doing that well. So you got to pay attention. Now, the only thing I ask is when you get on Jeopardy, you just give me a cut. Okay. Now, he didn't win that much, so it wouldn't be, you'd get like $10 from him. I'm still waiting. Yeah, I'll never see it. Anyway, there are 3 main fronts. What are they? Well, we know about North America, because we're here in North America, right? So we've heard about the French and Indian War. That's the part of the 7 Years' War in North America. The French fighting the British and the Native Americans, getting involved on both sides. But also, of course, they're fighting in Europe. Makes sense. This is where they are, right? The French and the British are in Europe, but they're drawing in these other allies like the Prussians and so forth, and also in India. So there are 3 areas in which this battle or these battles are taking place. So let me just look quickly at those 3 areas. First, in Europe, it's the British and the Prussians versus the Russians, the French, and the Austrians. Do you remember in the American Civil War, you probably studied that, they had people who helped the British that weren't British? What were they called? What were they usually called? Remember? Starts with an H. Short word. Usually they call them Huns, right? Huns, H-U-N-S. Well, the Huns are really the Prussians. All right, the same people. So the British have made allies with the Prussians, even here in the 7 Years' War. And in Europe, whereas, in North America, they're getting American colonists and some of the Native American groups to fight on their side against the French. In Europe, they've got the Prussians helping them, and they're fighting a coalition of the Russians, French, and Austrians. And what are they fighting over? Guess what? The main point of contention is Silesia. In the end, however, there is no change of territory. So really, all the fighting in Europe doesn't change. Silesia still remains with the Prussians, and the Austrians do not gain it. All this is settled with the Treaty of Paris of 1763. That's a very important treaty for this period. The Treaty of Paris of 1763. And that's going to come back up again, so don't worry. Every slide. Now what about in India? This is primarily the British fighting the French. And obviously some local people are getting involved. That is local by people from India. The French had laid claim to the city of Madras. But in the end, the British won. And to make a long story short, the British gained control of all the French territory in India. So, the score in Europe, their allies, the Prussians, got to keep Silesia, but no change of territory. So that's kind of a win. It's a draw, but, you know. In India, they beat the French, and they get all the territory that the French had had, and this pretty much is paving the way for them to take over control of all of India, which they will do shortly after this. Now in North America, that might be the one you're most familiar with. They're fighting the French, the British are fighting the French and the Native Americans, the Indians, the French and Indian War. So what's the outcome? Well, the outcome, the French get beat. So the 7 Years' War in North America, known as the French and Indian War, it's the British versus the French, with, of course, the 13 British colonies, the Americans, the colonialists, fighting on the side of the British, and, of course, the lion's share of Native American tribes helping the French. But there were a couple of tribes, couple of groups helping the British. Part of the issue here is that the British colonies are really growing rapidly, but the French had claimed large territories but never settled them. They just say, well, we claim everything along the Mississippi River, everything along the Ohio River, everything along the Great Lakes. That's all French territory. But they didn't really inhabit it. They had a few forts along rivers and some of the Great Lakes. But they didn't really go out and settle the land. That wasn't why the French were there. They weren't interested in farming. They were interested in timber. They were interested in skins, like beaver pelts and stuff like that. So they were there for some very specific trade goods that they wanted. Whereas the British are setting up towns and villages and farms, and they're cutting down forests. This is why most of the Native Americans sided with the French. It's the lesser of two evils. They probably would have rather not have either of them there, but if we're going to have one of them, we'd rather have the French, because the French, they don't plow up the fields, they don't cut down the trees. And so this basically brings into play Canada, the territories of Canada and Louisiana. And of course, Louisiana, much bigger than the state of Louisiana now. It's all along the Mississippi Valley, because the French wanted hunting and timber and trapping and fishing. And so they were seen as less threatening by the local population. So that sets the stage. I have a couple of slides left here, so let me try to go through them. If you don't get everything written down, you can go back and look at it online. But this is just a map, nothing to write here. And I'm not going to go over into details, but you see all those little red dots? That's where there were major battles during the 7 Years' War. Notice most of them along the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Great Lakes, and the Upper Ohio Valley. So the two main areas of conflict, the Great Lakes, we still got a couple of minutes, the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Ohio River, and of course the French get the support of the Indians, who see them as less threatening. Now, the French troops outnumbered the British troops, but the British had the Navy. And the British Navy begins to cut off the French supplies going up the St. Lawrence River, St. Lawrence Seaway, and begins cutting off their gunpowder and stuff like that that they needed. And that's really the turning point of the war. Now here's the last slide. With a minute left, there's not that much on this slide. Basically, the end of the war, of the 7 Years' War, we see British victory coming. The French are defeated on the seas and in Quebec. And in 1763, the Treaty of Paris awards to Britain all of Canada and all the lands in North America to the Mississippi River. Florida is transferred from Spain to Britain. You might want to mark that, right? 1763 is when Florida goes from being a Spanish possession to a British possession, and Louisiana from being a French possession to a Spanish possession. And the bottom line is, by 1763, Great Britain is the world's largest colonial power. They control most of India, most of North America, at least everything this side of the Mississippi, as well as Canada. All right, we'll leave it there. We'll see you on Thursday.